So in the last video, we started talking about the Iranian hostage crisis. And again, this took place as a result of the U.S.-backed Shah of Iran trying to westernize Iranian society. And this greatly angered conservative Muslims in Iran. And on top of that, he was suppressing political dissenters. So the people who opposed the Shah hated the United States. So again, in 1978, the Iranians overthrew the Shah, and the revolutionary government took power. And the revolutionary government was headed by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And November of 1979, because Carter invited the deposed Shah to come to the U.S. for medical treatment, then 400 Iranian Muslim militants stormed the American embassy in Tehran and held the Americans inside hostage. So that's where we're picking up with today. Carter's dilemma. So the militants who seized the embassy demanded two things. They wanted the return of that Shah, the deposed Shah, the one they had overthrown from power, and the surrender of his assets to the Iranian government. And in exchange, they would give back the American captives. Well, Carter refused and froze Iranian assets that were held in the United States. He also banned trade with Iran until the hostages were released. And so a stalemate developed and months went by. So in April of 1980, Carter ordered a military rescue mission. And unfortunately, the raid was a fiasco because several of the helicopters broke down. And this forced Carter to call off the rescue. And so the stalemate was continuing to go on. In the process, there was like a confused departure attempt. There was a crash that killed 8 American commandos. And the Iranian news coverage made fun of this. It was like a huge joke. Well, the Shah of Iran, the one who had been overthrown, died in exile in 1980. And still, the Iranians made no move to release these American hostages. So in the middle of Carter's dilemma, the election of 1980 takes place. And despite his difficulties, Carter managed to win his party's nomination. So Carter was the Democratic nominee going in for his second term. And Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, ran on the Republican ticket. And if you remember, in a previous election, he almost beat out the president for his own party's nomination. He didn't, but he almost did. So it showed the popularity of Ronald Reagan. Reagan had actually been a New Deal Democrat, supported FDR and the New Deal, and he had turned conservative, and he promised to decentralize the federal government, in other words, turn power of the federal government over to the states and to the local governments. And so Carter and Reagan really both ran sort of negative campaigns, and in the end, Reagan won handedly. He polled over 43 million popular votes to Carter's 35 million. And so in Congress, Republicans won the Senate, and they cut the Democratic majority in the House. And so on the day of Reagan's inauguration, Iran released the 52 hostages. And just as a side note, they had been held for 444 days at that point, so over a year. So Reagan as president, what did he do? Reagan was a conservative at heart, so that always means tax cuts and make the federal government smaller. Reagan demanded reductions in federal spending and a reduction in the deficit. And one thing that happened while he was president, in August of 1981, shortly after he had taken office, the nation's air traffic controllers went on strike. And Reagan ordered them to go back to work. And when they didn't, he discharged all 11,400 of them and hastily trained replacements. Pretty much destroyed the air controllers union. So he proved right away that he was really no one to be trifled with. His calls for cuts in the federal programs focused mainly on social services, and he wasn't cutting social services altogether. He was turning that over to the states. He did cut welfare, student loans, food stamps, and again gave the responsibility of those things to the state. He did request tax cuts to stimulate the economy and to generate new jobs. His goal was to cut taxes by 30%, and Congress did agree to cut income taxes by 25% over 3 years. And at this point, there were no tax brackets, so high-income individuals received a huge cut in taxes. Also, inheritance taxes and gift taxes were lowered. So Reagan won congressional approval of a budget that cut domestic programs by $39 billion. So that kind of sums up Reagan domestically. In foreign affairs, he pursued a hardline anti-communist foreign policy and engaged in a huge military buildup to meet the threat of the Soviet Union. He installed cruise missiles in Europe. He tried to undermine the leftist government of Nicaragua and attempted to bolster the conservative government of El Salvador. He used American troops to overthrow a Cuban-backed regime in Grenada, which is a Caribbean island, in 1982. And he also sent American forces to serve as a part of an international peacekeeping force in Lebanon. Unfortunately, in October of 1983, 239 Marines died when a Muslim fanatic crashed a truck loaded with explosives into a building that housed the Marines. And so the next year, Reagan removed all of the Marines from Lebanon. In the election of 1984, Reagan, of course, won the Republican nomination, and Walter Mondale of Minnesota won the Democratic nomination. And Mondale had been Carter's vice president, and he had chosen Representative Geraldine Ford from New York as his running mate. And Mondale thought that Ferraro, which she was an Italian-American and a Catholic, he thought that she would appeal to conservative Democratic voters who had supported Reagan in 1980, and that her gender would attract bipartisan support from women. But this strategy failed to translate into votes for Mondale. So Reagan, of course, benefited from the advantages of incumbency. He was the previous president, and the support of the Christian right, like the right wing. Televangelists loved Reagan. Jerry Falwell, who founded the Moral Majority, started Liberty University and Thomas Road Baptist Church, and he wasn't the only one. But beyond that, Reagan enjoyed a broad base of support that included a number of working people and even Southerners who had traditionally voted Democrat. Or, again, Reagan had been a Democrat. He was immensely popular. And so there was the collapse of the New Deal coalition, which had worked to elect Democrats since the 30s. And on top of everything else, it resulted in a landslide victory for Reagan. In the Electoral College, it was like 525 to 13 votes. The interesting thing is that this was the case despite the fact that Mondale won 40% of the popular vote. Even though he won 40% of the popular vote, Reagan carried 49 of the 50 states. So that was a landslide victory for him. So the Reagan Revolution. Reagan's foreign policy changed very little at the onset of his second term. He maintained his call for Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. He wanted high defense budgets, or military spending, and he had vigorous anti-communist policies. However, after Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet Union's premier in March of 1985, he gradually softened his tone of anti-Soviet rhetoric. There was a series of summits where the two leaders met together and they began to break down hostilities and the suspicion that had separated their nations. And so in 1988, the two actually signed a treaty eliminating medium-range nuclear missiles. This SDI program, Congress balked at this. It seemed completely unrealistic. It was also called Star Wars. But basically, it would consist of a network of computer-controlled space stations that would detect oncoming enemy missiles and attempt to destroy them. The thing that made this such a joke was the explosion of the Challenger. That was what cast doubt on the idea of basing the national defense on the complex technology involved in controlling machines in outer space. In terms of domestic affairs, Reagan took the same path as his first term: tax cuts, less federal government activity, mainly welfare. That would be handed over to the states. And again, a strong defense budget, stronger armed forces. The president also affected a shift in the federal judiciary because during his presidency, he got to pick 3 Supreme Court justices. One of them, of course, they were all conservative. One of them was Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. So Reagan really didn't change very much on his policies from his first term to his second term. Always about stronger defense, tax cuts, and shifting government responsibility to the states instead of the federal government. So during the 1980s, the nation confronted its most serious health crisis in decades. In the early 80s, scientists identified acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, which was a disease caused by human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. And so this basically destroys the body's defense against infection. It makes you unable to fight any type of virus or anything like that. And so the disease spread when an infected person's bodily fluids came into contact with another person's. As it happens, the first victims in the United States were homosexuals. And sadly, HIV soon infected the nation's blood banks. So this spread to people who received blood transfusions and things like that. The government wasn't really quick to respond, but over time they came up with a nationwide campaign that urged safe sex, particularly the use of condoms to prevent diseases like this. The merger movement. So this refers to the large number of companies that were forced to merge or were taken over or forced to go private. During the Reagan years, the nation finally climbed out of the recession of the 1970s, but there was a movement in the 80s toward a concentration in business. And there were these groups called corporate raiders, which would buy businesses. And they raised cash by issuing high-interest bonds secured by the assets of the companies that they purchased. And so 25% of the Fortune 500 companies were either taken over, merged, or forced to go private. And there were around 25,000 mergers or acquisitions that took place. Some companies even acquired a bunch of debt or bought up unprofitable companies so that the corporate raiders wouldn't try to buy them out. But sadly, this was an age of debt. And payment on debt consumed about half of the pre-tax earnings of the nation's corporations. So half of their money was going to pay off debt, pretty much. A job for life. Corporations coped with debt in 2 ways. They either sold assets or they cut costs. And by cutting costs, it usually meant that they laid people off. A job for life. This was the slogan for IBM because it was an unofficial slogan, but the implication was that, once you get a job at IBM, you're set for life. You have job security. Well, even IBM eliminated more than a third of its workforce, 80,000 jobs between 1985 and 1984. There was also a shifting of corporations moving abroad. They took their jobs elsewhere where labor costs were much lower. They could pay people lower wages. They could get around taxes and things like that if they moved their companies abroad. Of even greater significance than the growing debt was the debt of the federal government. Reagan's policies of tax cuts and increased military spending produced large annual federal deficits. And so when Reagan took office, the federal debt was about $900 million. 8 years later, it was about 2.5 trillion. As of now, in 2016, it is over 18 trillion. So that's kind of a scary thought. The bipolar economy. So in spite of the corporate and governmental debt, the economy did begin to gain strength in 1982, and by the late 80s, it was growing at a rate unparalleled since the 60s. Prices went down, even though the volume of business was growing. The stock market soared. The economy was essentially undergoing a fundamental transformation. Even as the manufacturing industries of the Rust Belt, as it was called, these are the large factories of the Midwest, even as those declined, new industries popped up based on technology, and they sprung up in places like Silicon Valley of California. So by the end of Reagan's years as president, job opportunities and wages were declining in traditional heavy industry. Although the older corporations that survived the shakeout were more competitive in the global market, and high-tech and service industries replaced them, and they provided all kinds of opportunities for entrepreneurs. So American society was becoming increasingly polarized. Both the changing economy and the governmental policy benefited the affluent disproportionately, and it usually hit the unskilled or the semi-skilled laborers the hardest. The Iran-Contra arms deal. So this is two initiatives in foreign policy that seriously hampered the effectiveness of Reagan's administration. So in 1984, he had asked Congress to federally fund Nicaraguan Contras, or freedom fighters who were fighting against a communist government in Nicaragua. Again, Reagan was a hardline anti-communist, so he wanted to give federal funds to these freedom fighters to help them fight against this communist government. They were called the Sandinista government, and Congress said no. And so in the Middle East, switching gears for a second, in the Middle East, Iran and Iraq had been engaged in a bloody war since 1980. And furthermore, many people had blamed Iran for the holding of a number of American hostages by Lebanese terrorists. Reagan did not like bargaining with terrorists, but he did want to find a way to free those hostages. So he made this decision in 1985 to allow the indirect shipment of arms to Iran by way of Israel. And when this failed to work, he authorized the secret sale of American weapons directly to the Iranians. And so Marine Colonel Oliver North, who was an aide to the president's national security advisor, Admiral John Poindexter, came up with this plan where he would supply the Contras without using federal funds, because again, Congress turned Reagan down on sending money to Nicaragua. So the plan was to use the profits from the Iranian arms sales to provide weapons for the Contras. So it sort of tied these two separate events together. And again, he would use the profits from the arms sales to Iran to provide weapons for the Nicaraguan freedom fighters. And so once this deal was disclosed, it led to Senate hearings, court trials. Many people involved resigned from their jobs, and this made Reagan really unpopular with Congress. He still remained personally popular. Many people didn't even know this was going on, but Congress did not like him after this. So this concludes Chapter 31, and we'll pick up with our final chapter in the next video with like 1990 to the present.